He had been awake since before dawn, the thin light of morning just beginning to creep over the rooftops. The small apartment smelled faintly of breakfast he had quickly thrown together for his child, a mix of toast and burnt coffee. There was never enough time in the mornings. Every day was a rush, a scramble between one job and another, yet somehow he kept going. For his child, he reminded himself silently, as he tied shoelaces and brushed small teeth with care, trying to hide the exhaustion etched into his own face. The child looked up at him with wide, sleepy eyes, holding a small toy car in one hand and a blanket in the other. There was a trusting innocence there, a belief that the world could be kind, that someone would always be there to catch you when you fell. He kissed the top of the child's head, trying to give a smile that reached his tired eyes. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll get through today." The words felt hollow even as they left his lips because he knew the day would be long, filled with labor and worry, but somehow they had to be enough. Breakfast was eaten quickly, a hurried conversation over spilled cereal, and then it was time to head out. The streets were already alive with movement, cars honking, people rushing to work, the familiar smell of exhaust mixed with the faint aroma of street food. He carried a worn-out bag slung over one shoulder, filled with papers and tools for the day ahead. This was his life, steady, difficult, and entirely dependent on keeping going. The first job was at a small delivery company, where he loaded boxes and parcels into trucks lifting heavier than his own body weight. The foreman didn't care much about exhaustion or back pain. Everything had to move. Everything had to reach its destination, and he moved, silently cursing the ache in his shoulders and the soreness in his knees. By mid-morning, the sweat had soaked through his shirt, and his hands were raw from gripping the metal handles of crates, yet he couldn't let himself stop. There was rent to pay, bills to cover, and a child waiting at home who depended entirely on him. Every task completed was a small victory, a step closer to keeping the fragile balance of life intact. As the sun climbed higher, the streets became hotter, crowded with cars and the occasional bicyclist weaving through traffic. He paused for a moment to take a drink of water, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The city had a way of making a person feel small, a tiny figure moving through a massive machine that didn't notice them. And yet in that smallness he felt responsibility, an unshakable need to protect and provide for the one person who depended on him most. After finishing the morning deliveries, he moved to his second job, a small mechanic shop tucked between a bakery and a laundromat. The work here was different, less lifting, more patience and precision, the smell of oil and metal filling the air. He greeted the owner with a nod and got straight to work, checking the brakes on a car and replacing worn parts. It was demanding work, both physically and mentally, yet it was steady and reliable, something he could count on just barely. His mind, however, was never fully on the work. He thought of the child waiting at home, of dinner that would need to be prepared, of homework and bedtime stories that he couldn't afford to miss. Even in the middle of tightening bolts and listening to the hum of engines, he was planning the next step, calculating how to make every minute count, how to stretch every dollar further than it should go. By late afternoon, fatigue settled in, a heavy blanket pressing on his shoulders. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the streets and alleyways. He had almost finished the last task when a commotion nearby caught his attention. A crowd had gathered at the corner of the street, voices shouting and pointing, and instinctively he moved closer. A car had collided with a motorbike, the rider thrown violently onto the asphalt. People were standing around unsure what to do, some frozen, others on their phones. The motorbike rider, a young woman, was sprawled on the ground, bleeding and barely conscious. Panic rippled through the crowd, but no one seemed willing to take action. Without thinking, he pushed through, dropping the tools he had been carrying, his heart hammering in his chest. Time slowed, the noise around him fading as he knelt beside her. Her breathing was shallow, a soft groan escaping her lips. Blood stained her clothes, and her eyes, wide and scared, met his for a fleeting second. "Stay with me," he said firmly, keeping his hands steady despite the adrenaline pounding in his veins. He assessed the situation quickly, checking for major injuries, trying to keep her calm. He had no medical training beyond a basic first aid course, but he knew he had to act. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted, looking around at the crowd. But no one stepped forward. They were frozen, indecisive, afraid, just spectators to someone else's crisis. He pressed a hand to a wound on her leg, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, and then gently adjusted her position so she could breathe more easily. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, repeating it more to convince himself than her. Her eyes fluttered, a weak nod barely visible. She tried to speak but could only whisper something unintelligible. Minutes felt like hours, and every second was filled with urgency and fear. He talked to her constantly, trying to keep her alert, trying to keep panic from taking over. The ambulance sirens in the distance finally signaled hope. But he knew they still had a long way to reach them. When the paramedics arrived, he helped them lift her onto a stretcher, explaining as clearly as he could what had happened. They nodded, taking over with professional efficiency, but he lingered, watching as they sped away toward the hospital. The crowd had dispersed, whispers and murmurs left in their wake. But he remained on the sidewalk, hands trembling, chest tight. The walk home was slow, every step heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't thought about the consequences, about losing time at his job or the potential trouble he could face for leaving early. None of that mattered at the moment. All that mattered was that he had acted when it counted, that he had not stood by while someone's life hung in the balance. Back in the apartment, he found the child waiting, eyes wide with concern and curiosity. "Did you help someone?" the child asked softly, picking up on the tension and the faint traces of worry on his face. He knelt down, hugging the small body close. "Yes," he said, keeping the explanation simple. "Someone needed help and I had to make sure they were safe." The child nodded, accepting the answer without question, trusting that their parent had done what was right. Evening settled in, the apartment filled with the sounds of a city winding down, distant sirens, voices, and the occasional honk of a horn. He sat quietly for a while, exhausted but unable to sleep. Thoughts of the woman, her frightened eyes and pale face lingered in his mind. Who was she? Would she be okay? Would she remember him? The day had started like any other, filled with work and worry, and ended in chaos and uncertainty. Yet beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was a quiet satisfaction. He had risked his own comfort, his own stability, for a stranger he didn't know, and in doing so, he had acted on something that mattered far more than money or routine. As he finally prepared the child for bed, reading a story and brushing hair gently, he felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the small, steady pulse of hope. Life was hard and the future uncertain, but he had done something meaningful, something that reminded him that even in the hardest moments, there was room for courage and compassion. And as the child's eyes closed, a soft breath marking the end of another day, he stood by the window looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, the woman he had saved was fighting to survive, and he had been a part of that fight, a small, quiet hero in an ordinary world. He didn't know if anyone would ever thank him, if anyone would recognize the risk he had taken, or if it would change anything at all, but it didn't matter. He had acted when it counted, and that was enough. That was enough to remind him that being a parent, being kind, and being brave were all things that could exist even in the hardest of lives. He finally sat down, exhaustion pulling him into a heavy chair, letting the weight of the day settle into his bones. The night was quiet, the city outside moving relentlessly, indifferent to individual struggles, yet he felt a strange sense of connection. Life continued, unpredictable and unforgiving, but somehow, he had found a way to make a difference, however small. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that tomorrow, when the alarm rang and the world demanded more than he felt capable of giving, he would rise again, because life required it, because his child needed it, and because courage, in its simplest form, was not about recognition, but about doing what was right when no one was watching. The morning after the accident, the apartment felt unusually quiet. The child had already gone off to school, excited about a small project to present later in the day, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He moved around the kitchen slowly, making a simple breakfast for himself, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind. The image of her lying on the street, pale and frightened, would not leave him. He had done what he could, but the uncertainty of whether she had survived gnawed at him. He tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the practical demands of life. Bills needed to be paid, groceries needed to be bought, and work awaited him. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm there was a subtle tension, a quiet expectation that something had changed. even if he did not know what. By mid-morning, he was on his way to the mechanic shop for the day's work. His hands were still sore from lifting and helping the injured woman, and his mind wandered constantly. The routine of checking engines and tightening bolts felt oddly comforting, a distraction from the lingering anxiety. He greeted his co-workers with a nod, though his thoughts remained elsewhere. "Hey," one of them said, noticing his distracted look. "You okay? You look like you didn't sleep a wink." "I'll manage," he replied, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a long day yesterday," he didn't elaborate. Few could understand the quiet tension that came with suddenly being part of someone else's story, someone whose life you had touched in an instant. The thought of the woman, lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable and alone, made him uneasy. He wanted to know she was safe, yet he had no way of finding out. Hours passed slowly. He worked on a car that had a stubborn engine, the smell of oil and metal filling the small workshop. His movements were automatic, hands knowing what to do even when his mind was elsewhere. He caught himself glancing at the clock frequently, wishing the day would pass quickly so he could return home and try to distract himself from worry. Around mid-afternoon, while taking a brief break outside, he heard a voice call his name. He turned to see a nurse approaching, carrying a clipboard, her expression professional but gentle. "You helped a patient yesterday," she said, hesitating slightly. "Do you have a few minutes to answer some questions?" His heart jumped. "Yes, of course," he said, setting his water bottle down. He followed her to a quiet corner, curiosity mixed with anxiety. The nurse explained that the woman he had saved was stable now. She was recovering, though the injuries had been serious. The paramedics had acted quickly, and his intervention had made the difference between life and death. Hearing this, relief and pride washed over him in equal measure. She's awake now," the nurse added, glancing at him cautiously. "She's been asking about the person who helped her. About you." He felt a lump in his throat. "I didn't do anything special." "Anyone would have done the same," he said quickly, as if to downplay the significance. But inside he felt a strange mix of recognition and unease. "She insists on thanking you," the nurse continued, "but she's very private. She doesn't want visitors just yet. Can you leave your contact information?" He nodded, scribbling his number on the clipboard. The nurse smiled, giving him a brief pat on the shoulder before walking away. He watched her leave, a strange sense of anticipation settling over him. He didn't know her, yet somehow he felt connected to her life now in a way he hadn't expected. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He went through the motions at work, trying to focus on engines and oil stains, but his mind kept drifting back to the hospital. When the day finally ended, he hurried home, carrying a mixture of exhaustion and nervous curiosity. At home, the child bounded in with a bright smile, chattering about the day at school. His worries eased slightly, the small, lively presence of the child grounding him in the ordinary joys of life. Yet, even as they played with toy cars and shared a quick dinner, his thoughts kept returning to the stranger he had saved. The next few days were a strange mix of tension and routine. He continued to work, still exhausted from long hours, yet he found himself thinking about her constantly. Who was she? What was her life like? He wondered if she would remember his face, if she would ever speak to him again. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but he told himself that he had done all he could. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. He was walking through the streets after finishing work when he noticed a group of people gathering near a small cafe. Curious, he moved closer and saw a familiar figure being helped out of a car. Her face was bandaged in places and she moved cautiously, leaning slightly on the arm of another person. His heart skipped a beat. It was her. She was alive, and she was moving through the crowd with a mix of determination and hesitation. He didn't approach immediately, unsure if it was appropriate, but he watched as she disappeared inside the cafe with the others. A part of him wanted to follow, to ensure she was safe, yet he hesitated, respecting the boundaries that had been set. Over the next few days, he received occasional phone calls from the hospital. Updates on her recovery were given politely, but details were scarce. He learned that she had been admitted under special care, and that her family had arrived. The woman had survived because of the quick action he had taken, yet the identity of her family remained undisclosed. Life continued in its relentless rhythm. He worked long hours, prepared meals for the child, helped with homework, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet tension remained. He felt drawn into a story he did not fully understand, a life that was intertwined with his own in ways he could not yet see. One evening, while preparing dinner, he received an unexpected call. It was from a number he did not recognize. Hesitant but curious, he answered. "Hello," a calm voice said. "We are calling from the office of a private family. You helped someone in an accident recently. We would like to speak with you." His heart raced. "Yes, I helped someone," he stammered. Is she okay?" "She is stable now," the voice replied. "And she has asked that we contact you. Would you be willing to meet with us?" He hesitated, uncertain of what to expect. The idea of meeting the family of the woman he had saved was intimidating. What if they were angry, suspicious, or disapproving? What if his ordinary life clashed with theirs? Yet deep down he knew he could not refuse. I can meet," he said finally. "Where should I come?" The voice gave him the address and a time, and then the call ended. He sat down staring at the phone, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation swirling inside him. He thought about the child, about the precarious balance of life, and about the strange twist of fate that had drawn him into someone else's story. The following day, he prepared carefully. He wore a clean shirt, combed his hair, and rehearsed simple words in his mind, trying to calm the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. The child noticed his unusual behavior and asked questions, but he gave only gentle, reassuring answers, masking the tension he felt inside. When he arrived at the address, he was met by a discreet, quiet security guard who led him into a small, well-kept waiting room. The air smelled faintly of flowers and polished wood, a stark contrast to the streets he navigated daily. He felt out of place, the plainness of his clothing and the weariness etched on his face standing in contrast to the pristine surroundings. Minutes later, a woman appeared, moving cautiously, her steps careful and measured. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. There was a moment of silence, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared memory that bound them together. You saved me," she said softly, her voice still tinged with weakness but filled with gratitude. He shook his head quickly. "I didn't do anything special," he said, trying to downplay it. "Anyone would have done the same. I just did what I could." Her eyes searched his, a flicker of something deeper passing through them. Relief, gratitude, curiosity. "No," she said firmly. "You risked yourself for me. You didn't have to. And yet you did. I remember." The moment was quiet but intense, filled with an unspoken understanding. He felt a mixture of pride and awkwardness, unsure of how to respond. They were strangers in many ways, yet bound by an extraordinary experience that transcended ordinary life. Before he could say more, a man entered the room. Tall, composed, with an air of authority, he approached the woman and then looked at him directly. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet evaluation that made the ordinary man feel small. "This is the person who helped you?" the man asked, his tone measured, controlled. The woman nodded. "Yes, he saved me," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of truth. The man studied him for a long moment, and he felt the weight of judgment pressing down. He shifted uneasily, aware of the stark differences in their lives, yet unwilling to shrink from the moment. "You did a brave thing," the man said finally, his tone softening slightly. "Not many would act as you did. You should be proud." Relief and a sense of disbelief washed over him. He had expected scrutiny, perhaps disapproval, but instead there was recognition. There was acknowledgement of his courage and humanity, something that money and status could not buy. As the conversation continued, he learned more about her situation, her family, the seriousness of the accident, the challenges she faced. Yet despite the difference in their worlds, there was a shared understanding, a bridge formed through the raw, unfiltered experience of life and survival. By the time he left, the sun had dipped low, casting warm light across the streets. He walked home slowly, replaying the events of the meeting in his mind. The ordinary life he led felt different now, touched by something extraordinary. He had entered a world he did not fully understand, yet had been recognized for something pure and human. Courage, compassion, and the willingness to act when it mattered most. That night, as he tucked the child into bed, he felt a quiet shift inside himself. The world was larger than his struggles, filled with unexpected connections and profound moments. He had done something meaningful, and in return the world had acknowledged him, if only briefly. He went to bed that night with a sense of cautious hope. Life would continue to be hard, demanding, and unpredictable. But for the first time in a long while he felt seen, respected, and quietly powerful in the knowledge that even in the smallest, simplest acts, a person could change someone else's life forever. The next morning, he woke with a strange tension in his chest. Sleep had come in fits and starts, his dreams filled with fragments of yesterday's meeting. Her eyes had held a mix of gratitude and something he could not name, and the memory lingered. It was unsettling, this sense of being pulled into a world he had never known, a life so different from his own yet inexplicably connected to him now. He got the child ready for school, the usual routine feeling heavier than normal. The small tasks, making breakfast, brushing teeth, tying shoelaces, felt both grounding and absurdly mundane in contrast to the extraordinary events swirling in his mind. He kissed the child on the forehead and tried to smile, masking the unease that had settled into his thoughts. Work at the mechanic shop was no refuge. Every noise, every movement reminded him of yesterday's conversation. His hands moved on autopilot, tightening bolts and checking engines, but his mind wandered constantly. Thoughts of her fragile condition and the quiet authority of her father pressed against him. He felt small, ordinary, insignificant in comparison. It was during the lunch break that a text arrived, short and unexpected. "Can you come to the office this afternoon? The matter concerns you directly." He stared at the screen, heart thudding. The number was unfamiliar, but the tone of the message left no room for hesitation. Something important was about to happen. He glanced at the child's lunchbox, the tiny sandwich carefully packed, and then at the clock. He needed to arrange for someone to pick up the child from school, a brief but necessary step before heading out. By the time he reached the office, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange. The city bathed in the late afternoon light. The building loomed tall and imposing, glass windows reflecting the fading sun. He paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath, aware that stepping inside would change everything. A receptionist guided him to a private office. The walls were lined with bookshelves and tasteful art, a stark contrast to the cluttered, oil-stained world he was used to. The furniture was polished, the air cool and controlled, and every detail seemed designed to signal power and order. He was asked to wait, and in those minutes, anticipation and dread mingled in his chest. The quiet ticking of a clock and the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the room, each sound amplifying his nervous energy. He felt exposed, as though every ordinary detail of his life would be measured against the polished standards of this new world. Finally, the door opened. She stepped in, cautious but composed, still recovering from her injuries. She moved with a careful grace, and as their eyes met, the tension between them was immediate. There was recognition, yes, but also the weight of circumstance pressing down, a silent acknowledgement that life had thrust them together in ways neither had chosen. And then the door opened wider. He froze as the man who had entered the previous meeting appeared again. Taller than he remembered, his presence filled the room with authority. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet control that demanded attention, and then the words dropped, slow and deliberate. "She is my daughter," the man said. The room seemed to shrink, air heavy and sudden. He blinked, unable to speak at first, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. The woman he had saved, the fragile figure he had seen lying on the street, was the daughter of the powerful man sitting across from him, the man who had the power to shape companies, careers, and fortunes. The man who had been silently evaluating him from the moment he stepped inside. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. I didn't know," he managed to say. I just saw someone in need. I had to help." The daughter nodded, her expression calm but intense. "I know," she said softly. "You didn't know, and yet you acted. That's why I remember you. That's why I insisted someone contact you." The father leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you understand the position this puts you in?" he asked. There was no anger in his tone, only the cold clarity of someone who understood consequences and control. "You have acted bravely, yes, but now you are part of my world, whether you like it or not." He nodded, feeling suddenly small and exposed. I understand." "I didn't mean to. You didn't have to," the daughter interrupted gently. You did what was right. That's enough. Her words were reassuring, yet the gravity of the situation pressed on him. He was ordinary, simple, a single parent struggling to make ends meet. And now he had been thrust into a world that operated on entirely different terms. The father studied him for a long moment, weighing the words carefully. "I respect courage and integrity," he said finally. "And you have both. But you must understand the risks. Your actions, however noble, have consequences that reach far beyond the street yesterday." He nodded again, uncertainty gnawing at him. I understand. I'll do whatever is needed. I don't want to cause problems." The daughter's gaze softened and she leaned back in her chair slightly, observing him. "I don't want you to change who you are," she said. "But you should be aware. My world is different. What is ordinary for you may not be understood there. You acted from instinct, from kindness. That matters more than anything else, but there are challenges ahead." The father's tone shifted slightly, more measured now. "We will expect discretion," he said. "Nothing that happens here should leave these walls without permission. This is not just about your safety. It's about the stability of everything around us." He swallowed again, the weight of the responsibility pressing down. The small courage he had shown on the street had led to something far larger than he could have imagined. He had entered a world he barely understood, a world where mistakes could have far-reaching consequences, yet he also felt a quiet resolve building within him. He had done what was right once, and he would do it again if necessary. The daughter gave a small, encouraging smile, one that conveyed both gratitude and understanding. "I want you to know," she said, "that I will not forget what you did, and I will not judge you for who you are. That day you were extraordinary in a simple way. That matters more than anything." Her words eased some of the tension, yet he remained acutely aware of the difference between their worlds. His life was simple, constrained by necessity and daily struggle, while hers was shaped by wealth, expectations, and influence. And now, for reasons beyond his understanding, their lives had collided. The meeting continued with discussions that were careful and measured. They talked about what had happened, the seriousness of the accident, and the necessity of discretion. There was no lecture, no attempt to belittle him, only clear guidance about what was expected moving forward. He listened intently, absorbing each word, aware that missteps could be costly. By the time he left the office, the city was dark, lights twinkling across the streets like small stars. He walked slowly, processing the revelations. The ordinary life he had taken for granted felt fragile and precarious now. He was still a single parent, still struggling to make ends meet. Yet now he carried a connection that could change everything. He returned home to the child, who greeted him with a cheerful chatter, unaware of the complexities that had unfolded during the day. Preparing dinner, helping with homework, and tucking the child into bed became acts of normalcy he clung to desperately. These moments grounded him, reminding him of the life he had always fought to protect. That night he sat by the window looking out over the city. The lights reflected on the glass, creating patterns that seemed almost alive. He thought of her, of the gratitude in her eyes, and of the powerful man who had reminded him that actions have consequences far beyond what one can see. The day's events had changed him, shifting the boundaries of his life in ways he could not yet fully understand. He thought about courage, the kind that did not seek recognition, that simply acted when necessary. He had felt it yesterday on the street and again today in the meeting. And he realized that courage was not measured by the size of the act, but by the willingness to act when it mattered, even at personal risk. Sleep came late that night, and when it did, it was restless, filled with images of streets, offices, and faces that now belonged to his world in a way they never had before. He dreamed of accidents and recoveries, of small hands reaching for his own, and of a life that seemed both familiar and entirely new. The next days were a delicate balance. He continued his work, maintained routines at home, and cared for the child with the same diligence as always. Yet, there was a new awareness, a careful attention to how his actions could ripple outward. Even ordinary tasks felt charged with possibility, as though any moment could carry significance far beyond the immediate. Through it all, he remained quietly observant of her recovery. Occasional messages came through the hospital, updates on her condition, each one a relief and a reminder of the responsibility that now rested in part on him. He had saved a life, yes, but that act had opened doors and revealed truths that demanded vigilance. humility and courage in equal measure, and so, the ordinary world he had known and the extraordinary world he had touched began to overlap, not smoothly, not comfortably, but inevitably. He walked forward, aware of the dangers, the expectations, and the unknown challenges that lay ahead. Yet he also carried a quiet confidence, born of the knowledge that he had acted rightly when it mattered most. In the stillness of the evening, sitting alone in the quiet apartment, he reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him here. A single act of courage, a moment of selfless instinct, had intertwined his life with people and experiences far beyond his imagining. And while fear and uncertainty pressed on him, he felt something else too. The steady, unshakable presence of integrity. The quiet strength of doing what is right even when the world does not notice. The days after the meeting passed slowly, each one carrying an unusual tension. He returned to his routines at work and home, yet everything felt different now. Even the mechanic shop, once a place of comfort and predictable challenges, felt heavier. Every interaction seemed slightly amplified, as though the world were watching him more closely than before. He tried to focus on the tasks at hand, checking engines, replacing worn-out parts, lifting heavy machinery, but his mind kept returning to her father, and to the unexpected consequences of his courage. The ordinary life he had known felt fragile, like a small boat on a vast, unpredictable sea. It started with small things. He noticed more attention from coworkers, subtle glances and whispered conversations whenever he passed by. He didn't know if they had heard about the meeting, or if they merely sensed the shift in his demeanor, but the awareness weighed on him. He had always wanted to remain invisible, to live quietly for the sake of the child. Now invisibility seemed impossible. One evening, as he was closing up the shop, his phone rang. The number was familiar, her father's office. He hesitated, then answered. "Good evening," a calm voice said. "We have a situation that requires your assistance. It will not be simple, but it is urgent. Can you come to the office immediately?" He swallowed, anxiety and determination mingling in his chest. He glanced at the clock. It was late, past the hour he usually returned home. The child would be at home waiting for him, and yet he knew there was no choice. The urgency in the voice left no room for refusal. "I'll be there," he said. The office felt colder than before, polished and distant. He followed a familiar security guard down the long corridor to a private room. The daughter was already there, sitting quietly, her eyes alert despite the faint bruises and bandages still visible on her skin. "We have a problem," her father said immediately. "One of our projects has become critical, and the situation may escalate quickly. We need someone we can trust to act without hesitation." He felt a tight knot in his stomach. His life had never included high-stakes business or dangerous decisions. Yet he understood the underlying message. He had been brought into this world not just as a hero of one day, but as someone whose choices now mattered. "What do you need me to do?" he asked cautiously. The father studied him, measuring his words. "You will be placed in a position where your judgment, your integrity, and your courage will be tested. Mistakes could be costly, not just to you, but to others. Can you handle that?" He nodded, feeling both fear and determination. "I'll do my best." The daughter looked at him, a small, encouraging smile forming. "We trust you," she said. "Not because of your skill or your knowledge, but because of who you are. You act when it matters, without hesitation. That matters more than anything else." The father handed him a folder thick with documents and instructions. "This is your first task," he said. "Study it carefully. You will need to act tomorrow." The walk home that night was quiet, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement after a light drizzle. Every step was heavy with thought. He thought of the child waiting at home, of the precarious balance of ordinary life and the extraordinary challenges now pressing down on him. He felt the weight of responsibility in a way he had never known, yet also the quiet pulse of determination. He would not fail. The next morning he woke early, reviewing the folder again and again. The instructions were complex, filled with unfamiliar terms and procedures. He took notes, asked questions when possible, and prepared himself as best as he could. Every word, every detail mattered. He understood that mistakes could have serious consequences. At the mechanic shop, he moved through the motions with unusual focus. Every task was completed meticulously, but his mind kept returning to the upcoming challenge. He thought about courage, the kind that did not seek reward but acted anyway. He had acted once, and now he would act again, no matter how uncertain the path. When he arrived at the designated location, a nondescript building downtown, he was greeted by a small team of professionals who were part of the project. They were skilled, competent, and wary, yet they accepted his presence without question. He was aware of their judgment, of the contrast between his ordinary life and their polished expertise. But he reminded himself that courage was not measured by knowledge alone. The first task was immediate and demanding. A mistake could result in delays, loss, or worse. He followed instructions carefully, making decisions that required both quick thinking and calm analysis. The pressure was immense, yet he felt a strange clarity. In moments of crisis, instinct and integrity guided him. Hours passed, tension building steadily. He moved quickly, efficiently, and with a focus that surprised even himself. His ordinary skills, problem-solving, careful observation, and determination, proved unexpectedly valuable. He realized that courage was not only about physical action, but also about mental clarity under pressure. During a brief break, the daughter approached him quietly. "You're doing well," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I know this isn't easy, but you're handling it better than I expected." He shook his head, humility and disbelief mingling. "I'm just trying to do what's right," he said. "I don't belong here. I'm not like you." "You belong wherever you choose to act with courage," she replied. "That's what matters. Don't underestimate yourself." Her words stayed with him, giving a quiet strength that carried him through the next phases of the task. The pressure increased. Decisions became more complex, and he faced moments where hesitation could be costly. Yet he remained focused, guided by the simple principle that he must act, and act rightly, regardless of consequence. By the afternoon, the situation had reached a critical point. A mistake by anyone else could have caused failure, but he remained calm, making the necessary decisions with both logic and care. The team began to recognize his steady presence, subtle nods and glances acknowledging his quiet effectiveness. It was not skill alone, but the courage to act without fear that earned their respect. When the task was finally completed, exhaustion settled over him like a heavy blanket. The father entered the room, his expression inscrutable at first, then softening slightly. "You performed admirably," he said. "Better than expected. You handled pressure with integrity, judgment, and courage. Few could have managed as you did." Relief and pride mingled in him, though he was careful not to let it show too strongly. "I just did what needed to be done," he said quietly. The daughter smiled, a mix of gratitude and admiration in her eyes. "You did more than that," she said. "You proved that courage is not about status or skill alone. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." He left the building later that evening, the city lights glowing softly around him. His mind replayed the day, the challenges, the fear, and the quiet victories. He thought of the child waiting at home, unaware of the high-stakes drama unfolding in a world far removed from their ordinary life. Home was a sanctuary, brief and grounding. He helped with homework, shared dinner, and read a story before tucking the child into bed. The normalcy of routine felt comforting, a reminder that life continued despite extraordinary pressures. Yet he also carried a quiet awareness that the world had shifted. He had stepped into challenges far beyond his ordinary life, and the consequences of action and inaction were clearer than ever. The following days brought new responsibilities. Each task was different but no less demanding, requiring judgment, moral clarity, and courage. He faced situations where shortcuts could have been easier, where bending rules could have saved time or reduced risk, yet he remained steadfast. His choices were guided by integrity, by the same instinct that had driven him to save a life on the street weeks before. Through it all, the daughter remained a quiet presence, checking on his progress, offering subtle guidance without interference. Their bond grew slowly, founded on respect, trust, and shared understanding. She did not seek friendship or favor, simply acknowledgement of the courage and integrity he consistently displayed.